In high school, I went from reading and appreciating stories to actually creating my own scary stories. I played a fantasy role playing game that some of you might recognize. If you recognize what you're seeing in this image right here, post in chat what exactly that game is. Two initials, they're the same ones, so with an ampersand in between. There we go. Thank you, Kimberly. D&D, or Dungeons and Dragons. It was a role-playing game where people would pretend to be wizards and warriors, and they would go on quests to defeat all sorts of creatures. Now, somebody had to create those quests, and that person was a dungeon master. And I love being a dungeon master because I loved creating adventures for my friends to go on. But I was a little bit sick and twisted, and I always tried to set the mood with my Dungeons and Dragons campaigns. So what I often did was I would make sure that all the lights were off in the room, and I would have candles burning. I actually had a big skull sitting on the table in front of me. I tracked down a whole bunch of soundtracks to scary movies, and I would play them as the soundtrack of the game. And I really wanted to just freak out my friends. Now, it just so happened that the game in high school was catching on. A lot of players were joining in, a lot of high schoolers. And there was a new fellow named Jack, who was the friend of one of the players, who said, I've heard of this Dungeons and Dragons. I want to see what the fuss is all about. So we invited him to come play with us. And this particular adventure that I had created was going to be like a one-night campaign where the players would go into a village where there were rumored sort of people who were kind of like zombies. They were being turned into mad men or mad women, and they would just start chanting Sandam. And so my friends formed a party. They went into this village to find out its secret. And in my mind, as the campaign is unfolding, I decided to turn this into a horror movie where each one of the players, each one of the characters would be turned into one of these zombie-like creatures, and he would just start chanting Sandam, Sandam, Sandam. And as the campaign went on, another player would be turned, and another one, and another one. The only person that was left was Jack, the new player to the group, who was panicking because he had no idea what he was supposed to do. And the other players went along for the ride, and they all started actually chanting Sandam, Sandam, as the music that was playing on the stereo would swell to this crescendo. And I let Jack's character escape from the village at the very end. Apparently, that campaign was so impressive for Jack that he had nightmares for about 6 weeks after that campaign. And I was filled with delight knowing that I gave nightmares to somebody in grade 11. And so I decided that really I would want to write more scary stories. Now, the reason why I'm telling you about the fantasy role-playing game is that in the book Haunted Hospital, I wanted a good reason for the characters to go into the haunted hospital. There's a group of 4 teenagers who go investigate this haunted hospital. But I noticed from the movies I watched and some of the books I've read, there were always implausible or not very believable reasons why characters would go into scary places. So I wanted something that would actually make sense about why these 4 kids would go into the hospital. I decided that they were playing a role-playing game. Not D&D, but one that I made up called Spirits and Specters. And instead of being wizards and warriors, the players would be paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, who are going into creepy locations to discover if there were ghosts there or not. And that gave the kids the perfect reason to go into the hospital. And that was one of the inspirations for the book. Now, the other inspiration was trying to find the right place. And I've been at a lot of schools and I've told a lot of stories, but I also ask kids questions about stories and what they like. And I asked them about what they thought of haunted places and which ones they liked. And more often than not, like 9 times out of 10, kids would tell me about haunted hospitals or asylums. And so I decided that I would have to write about a hospital. And I started thinking, what kind of hospital could I write about? And then I remembered in Edmonton, we had this hospital right here. Now, Some of you may recognize this building if you've been in Edmonton long enough. Anybody here recognize it? I see somebody chatting, posting in chat. Yes, yes, the Charles Camsell. This was a photo that I took over the summer, and you'll see that there's a construction fence right in front because it's no longer a hospital. A developer has picked it up and is now turning them into apartments. Now, I'll tell you a little bit of the history of this site. Back in, I think, 1913, the early 1900s, the Jesuits used the site to build a college to train Jesuit priests. Around the time of World War II, the American Army took over the facilities on this site because they were building a highway to Alaska and they were using this site as their army base. When the highway was built and the war was over, the Americans returned the buildings over to the federal government and they turned it into a hospital. I think at first it was a military hospital for soldiers injured in the war. And then later on, when TB, tuberculosis, a horrible respiratory disease that spread across the world, which will never happen again in our lifetime. Oh, wait a minute. So TB spread and affected a lot of people in Alberta and northern parts of Canada, and they had to be quarantined and treated. So a lot of people who were sick were ripped away from their families, put into the Charles Camsell to be treated for TB. And so they were upset for being separated from their family members. They were in pain, and some of them died. And then there were stories about their spirits walking the hallways. Now, ultimately, the buildings were torn down and the hospital was built. The building that you just saw was the one that was built in the 1960s. The building was eventually shut down, decommissioned as a hospital, and abandoned, I think, in 1992 or the early 90s, where it sat empty until just recently when a developer has picked it up to renovate it into apartments. So that's the history of the building. But you probably want to know more about its supernatural history. Now, I thought I could talk about it, but then I thought, you know what? There is an expert on the Charles Camsell. Rhonda Parrish actually wrote a nonfiction book called Haunted Hospital. So add an S, and you've got Rhonda Parrish's book. So I thought I would invite her as a special guest to talk a little bit about the real haunted hospital in Edmonton. Now, Rhonda is best known as an editor, but she's also an accomplished author who has written many books, paranormal books, and nonfiction books about haunted hospitals. And she has a special connection to the Charles Camsell because she lives a few blocks away from the hospital with her husband and their 3 cats. Now, when Rhonda's not busy editing and writing, she is playing Dungeons and Dragons, she is binging crime dramas, and she's cheering for the Oilers. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to bring on Rhonda Parrish with your virtual round of applause. Hello, Rhonda. Thank you for joining me for this virtual launch. Now, I'm going to launch in and ask you some questions about the Charles Camsell because I think there are a lot of people here who are curious about the Charles Camsell. So, first of all, just a general question. Do you or do you not believe in ghosts?
Oh, so you start with like the hard one.
The hard one.
I write paranormal nonfiction, but I'm really skeptical when it comes to ghosts. I tend to believe that most things have a mundane explanation rather than a supernatural one. But I really like ghost stories, so it doesn't even matter to me if they're necessarily real. They're a lot of fun.
Excellent. And I understand there are a few ghost stories connected to the Charles Camsell. Can you share some of the ones that you've heard over the years?
There are a lot of stories about the Charles Camsell. Um, my favorite, I've never actually been in the Charles Camsell Hospital. It's like 2 blocks from my house, like you said, and it's sort of it it looms over the neighborhood and it looms very large in my imagination and a lot of people's imaginations. And there's a lot of people who have, as paranormal explorers or urban explorers, who have gone through the hospital and had experiences that they can't possibly explain. Um, when I was researching for the book, I there were a lot of stories of people hearing screams and seeing lights that they couldn't explain. I was working with 2 paranormal explorers named Rona Anderson and Ben Mike and her partner, and they had actually done elaborate paranormal investigations inside the hospital, and they had some really cool stories. One thing that happened between when the hospital closed and when it started being gutted for the condos is that it was used as a set for some movies. It was in Ginger Snaps and um, White Coats. So when Ben and Rona were investigating it, some parts of the hospital had power because they were being used as movie and television sets, and some part of the hospital didn't have power because it had just been decommissioned and wasn't used anymore. So when they went there for their investigation, the first place that you're going to want to investigate if you're a paranormal investigator is the morgue, right? Like that's got to be your top stop. So they went over to the elevators, and there was a bank of two elevators, and one of the elevators had power, and one of the elevators didn't have power. So they took the one that had power and went down to the basement to investigate the morgue. And weirdly, they didn't actually see anything or hear anything too exciting in the morgue. So they were thinking, well, maybe it's time to go back upstairs. And they heard a ding in the hallway. So they went out into the hallway to see who had come down on the elevator. And when they got out there, the elevator that didn't have power, its doors opened. It didn't have
Oh my
power. You and I, we might go away from the elevator that doesn't have power, that's doors open. But Ben and Rona went to the elevator and they went to get on it. But just as they reached the doors shut and the elevator went up without them.
Oh my goodness, that's great. Now, you said that would you actually want to go into the Charles capsule at any point?
Oh, yes. I really, but when I moved into the neighborhood, it was already shut down and there was no trespassing signs everywhere. But I was so drawn to it that it was, if I wasn't lawful good, it would have been
Yeah.
very, very tempting to be one of those urban explorers and check it out.
Now, why do you think there's such a connection between hospitals and hauntings? Because I know your book doesn't just talk about the Charles capsule. There are many stories about haunted hospitals. It's almost as prevalent as like stories about like Sasquatch or Yeti. It's almost one of those things where there's always a creepy old house in somebody's town, and there's always like some like nobody wants to go to a particular hospital. So I'm just curious, why is that?
Well, if you believe in energy, if you believe in ghosts, hospitals are the perfect breeding ground for ghosts because like everything, life and death, like those dramas play out over and over and over every day in hospitals. And some most of our treatments, no, I wouldn't say most. Some medical treatments are just inhumane. And if you stop and think about them a lot, especially historical treatments, they can just cause nightmares, just the reality of those treatments. So then when you add on to it all of the stories of life and death and the dramas that go on in the hospital to that sort of medical setting, and then add the fact that a lot of people are just afraid of hospitals just straight up in general. It's just the perfect breeding ground for stories and ghost stories in particular, I think.
I'll be curious to see sort of what emerges. Like, obviously, we're dealing with the pandemic and COVID right now, but I wonder if it will spark sort of a new round of tales of terror from different hospitals, like the Misericordia or the Royal Alec. Right? You start thinking about
Right.
what could happen from this point forward.
Yeah, that would be really interesting because, as you alluded to before, like the Spanish flu pandemic, that has got so many stories that sprung up from that. So it would be bizarre for this current pandemic to not have the same sort of effect on people's imaginations and
Yeah, exactly.
uh,
Well, I remember like from the 1918 pandemic, the Edmonton connection. Did you write about this one as well? The Felicia at the
mhm.
Westmount School. where it was a school teacher from out east who came in, and then she sort of disappeared, and her
Yeah.
ghost walks the hallways. That the doors would close by themselves, lights would turn on mysteriously, and I actually did a presentation at Westmount. I talked to some of the teachers, and there were some teachers who refused to stay at that school after hours. They would take all their work home and do it there rather than stay at the school. And I remember there was one, the Workshop West, the theater in Edmonton, did sort of a traveling show. Like audience members would get on a bus and they'd go to different locations and they would see
Mhm.
the play. And I wrote a play, a little short play about a seance that was being conducted in Westmount Junior High School. And so we had to scout out the location, and the principal at the time took us on a tour of the basement. And one of the scariest
Mm.
things was there was a little sort of tiny door, about half the size of a human being, and it would actually go into the wall, like behind the wall in the basement, and it was a tunnel that sort of ran all through the basement of that school. And I said, we've got to work this into the story. We definitely have to work this into the story. So that building in itself is pretty creepy, but you throw in sort of the hauntings behind that, and suddenly you've got the makings of great stories.
That's so cool. I didn't know about the tunnel at all. And I think wasn't it used as a temporary hospital during that pandemic as well? I think
I
a
I
lot of
think it might
buildings
have
in the
been.
city were. Yeah,
I mean,
I think
I
it.
mean that pandemic hit a lot of people. I mean, I
Mhm.
know we're dealing with a lot of numbers, but that one was it just sort of went through everybody like wildfire. So I
They
can.
did not flatten their curve.
They did not. They were not
They did
masking,
not.
not social distancing. Not like us. We are all like at least 60 feet away from each other.
Yeah.
All
I
right.
mean, we've got
Sorry.
it easy because we have Zoom.
Yeah, we have Zoom. Imagine if we didn't have Zoom. All right, one more question for you. Now that the building is being renovated, do you think we'll have residents in there telling stories about the hauntings? Do you think the hauntings will continue, or do you think it's something where it lived when it was a hospital, and it's going to go away once it becomes apartments?
I think that I think the stories of hauntings will shift. I think it'll become I think that they will still exist. Yeah, I don't think that people are willing. People sort of like their ghosts. They even the ones that are scary, we like them. So people aren't going to be in a hurry to let them go. I expect the stories might change flavor a little bit, but I think that they'll still continue.
Well, excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Rhonda. I appreciate you taking the time to talk a little bit about the Charles Capsule. And remember, for those of you who are watching, if you want to find out more, she has a book called Haunted Hospitals that is actually for sale at Audrey's as well. So if you want to get her book and my book, you only have to remember just like one title and add an S to it. And really, it's a great
Exactly.
deal. It's a great deal. You get two books for the price of two.
It's like
Okay.
we planned it or something.
We planned it. All right. Thank you very much, Rhonda. Take care. We'll see you around.
Thank you.
All right. So there's a little bit about the Charles Capsule. Now, what I want to do to finish out the reading, and don't worry, I'll save some time for some questions. I'm going to do a little reading from the book. Now, to set things up, to give you some context for what I'm about to read, as I said, the kids are playing this role playing game where they pretend to be paranormal investigators. So they're going to investigate the haunted hospital. But the person who's made up the game, Xander, has to go in first to basically scout out the location and pick some places where he can create a scenario for the game. So he's actually going in by himself into the haunted hospital, and that's where we're going to pick up this reading. All right? Xander had found a way in. He pried the plywood sheet farther away from the window and crawled inside. His jacket snagged on a loose nail and tore a hole in the shoulder. Xander stuck a finger through the hole in the fabric and shook his head. Ugh, Mom is totally going to kill me, he muttered. He fished his phone out of his back pocket and switched on the flashlight mode. He swept the beam across the walls of the dusty room. Ugh, the place reeked. Xander headed to the door and pulled it open. The hinges groaned as the door swung inward. He poked his head into the hallway and flashed the light both ways. At one end was a large counter at the nurse's station. Beside the blacktop desk, a gurney sat on its side, rusted caster wheels dangling from the legs. At the other end of the hallway, double doors led deeper into the heart of the haunted hospital. The scene reminded Xander of an old video game his dad used to play, Silent Hill. He remembered once sneaking a peek as his dad killed zombie nurses and had nightmares for a month. A clang echoed from somewhere deep in the bowels of the building. What was that? Get a grip. It's nothing. Talking aloud to himself helped Xander calm his nerves. He took a breath and entered the hallway. The nurse's station would make a perfect home base for the game. He took a photo, then flipped the gurney back onto its wheels and pushed it against the counter. The metal frame squeaked and groaned, but it could still roll. Suddenly, a dark shape shot out from behind the station and scooted down the hallway. Xander aimed the light at it, his entire body throbbing with instant adrenaline. Who's here? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Anyone here? Xander froze as a cat bolted past him and zipped behind the nurse's station. Xander clutched the phone against his chest. He could feel his heart pounding. Okay, kitty. Nice kitty. Stupid kitty. Oh, shut up. Once his heart rate had returned to normal, Xander began to explore the maze of hallways that twisted and turned deeper and deeper into the building. He checked each of the rooms along the way. Some were empty. A couple still had beds in them. He took photos of potential sites that might work for spirits and specters. And it was giving him some story ideas. He tapped the voice recorder app on his phone and spoke into it. Allison Rigby died in this very room on a chilly winter night, he said, recounting some of the details from the legend he had researched. They'd be great for the mission setup. Even though she had contracted TB, she might have lived longer if the doctors hadn't injected her with experimental drugs. Her screams filled the hallways. The medical staff observed the poor woman gasping for air in her final moments. She died in utter pain and fear. Now, her spirit walks the halls. When he was done, he played the recording back. Not bad if I do say so for myself. I just need more haunted rooms for inspiration. He propped the door open with a rubber doorstop he had found on the floor and noted the room number, 176. He navigated new corridors, identifying landmarks to help him find his way back. His light flashed on an exit sign. The door opened to a stairwell, but Xander couldn't go up or down. You see, a giant tangle of barbed wire was nailed across both flights of stairs. Xander spoke into his phone. Stick to the main floor. No sense in wrecking more of my clothes. He headed out of the stairwell and explored the rest of the corridor. Another set of double doors loomed in the distance. He aimed his light at them. Two eyes reflected back at him from behind one of the windows. What the heck? When Xander looked closer, the eyes were gone. And there is a little reading from Haunted Hospital, a book that I hope that you'll want to pick up along with any of the other books that they have at Audrey's. Now, we've come to close to the end of my reading, but I want to take the time to answer any questions you might have. And also off to the side, you'll notice that I've posted some information with websites. If you want to find out what Rhonda's up to, her website's there. If you want to see my other books or my presentation schedule, you can check out martychan.com. Audrey's books, they're not open, but you can put an order over the phone or online. And I've talked to Kelly about this. And if you would like an autograph book, get your orders in before mid-November, because in the middle of November, I'm going to make my way to Audrey's with my mask and my rubber gloves and my Lysol, and I will autograph books for anybody who orders before the middle of November. Now, if you are in Edmonton, that's great. But if you're not in Edmonton, you can go track down the book at your local bookstore, or you can order it directly from Orca Book. They do have the physical copy as well as an ebook. And rumor has it they're going to come out with an audiobook sometime in the new year. Now, the final thing that I want to tell you about before we get to questions is my YouTube channel, Marty Chan Author. I am posting all sorts of videos up there. A lot of them are writing tips for students. So if you're a teacher or a parent who has a creative kid, every Tuesday I post a video with writing tips and story prompts. You can check them out. Please subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out to get a whole bunch of subscribers. And I've been doing lots of videos during the lockdown, during the pandemic. Some of them are specific to kids and writing tips. Some of them are cool little fun projects like Letters of the Pandemic, a satire about what life is like living in the pandemic in Alberta. So I'll be doing all sorts of creative things with that YouTube channel. Please do subscribe to that. All right, so we're going to cycle through and try to answer some of your questions. I'm going to go to chat and check out any questions that might have come through. Okay, so I am going through. Okay, this is the one part of the presentation I didn't quite figure out yet, trying to figure out how to navigate chat. Okay, so if there are any questions, you can post them right now. Oh, somebody's writing a book. Oh, somebody says, thank you for being a champion for literacy. Oh, thank you, Linda. I've really enjoyed doing a lot of these presentations. As you can see with the format tonight, I'm sort of using this kind of format for my virtual presentations now. So going into schools and doing writing workshops, I want to try to do more stuff that's a little more engaging for people. All right, so the question is, what do you do when you get stuck? When I get stuck, I eat a lot of chocolate chip cookies. I play some video games. I beat myself up about getting stuck, but really, if I have writer's block, the way to get through that is sometimes I find that in the story, at the point that I'm stuck, I realize that's not where the problem is. The problem probably happened 2 or 3 scenes earlier where I made a decision that took me down a wrong path. And so, what I need to do is I need to backtrack to the point where the character made the decision that led to the dead end in my story. Then at that point, I make that character decide a different solution or a different direction to go in. And that usually gets me past the point of writer's block. Now, here's the thing. It might bring me back to the exact same spot that I had writer's block, but because I came at it from a different direction, I actually then see the solution. So sometimes just exploring the story helps you find out how to get past the writer's block. In fact, if anyone here plays video games, and I'm dating myself when I talk about the video games that I play, but Super Mario, right? If you played Super Mario, there are all sorts of cool little hidden Easter eggs, things that you can discover if you don't just play straight through to the end. If you start wandering around and jumping into pipes and pressing on different things, you'll discover cool things in the game. Same thing with writing. If you take the opportunity to explore things around you, it gives you that opportunity to find out more about the story. And that's always a good thing as a writer. Now, how many days did it take for me to write The Haunted Hospital? Oh, thanks, Alexa. That's a great question. This book is for Orca Books, so I think it was around 12,000 or 14,000 words. So it's a little shorter than, let's say, one of my chapter novels, like The Mystery of the Graffiti Ghoul. When I sat down, it probably took me about first of all, it took me a long time to brainstorm the idea. So probably I spent about 3 months just trying to cook up the idea. So I didn't even write anything. So 3 months of brainstorming. And then when I actually sat down to write the draft, I started off with an outline, and that took me probably about 2-3 weeks to put that into shape. And once my editor approved of the outline and I actually had to write the draft, the writing of the draft, probably I would spread that over about 2-3 weeks worth of writing the first draft, and then probably 2-3 months worth of revising, because I'm the kind of writer who likes to go over my work and revise and make it better. So I try to rush through and get my first draft done so that I can go and have fun by revising the manuscript. And I usually revise it about 4 or 5 times before I'm ready to show it to somebody. Okay. Are there any other sites in Edmonton or Alberta that might inspire a sequel? Ooh. Oh, that's a good question. I will have to do a little more research on that. But one of the places that I'd be really fascinated to write about is there's a place. It's near Drumheller, and you have to cross like I think it's 11 or 12 bridges to get to this. Like I guess it's like it used to be a saloon, and now it's kind of like a restaurant slash museum. And apparently it's haunted. There's a stage magician who holds seances there, and apparently it's quite haunted. And so I thought it'd be really cool to write a scary story set in Drumheller or near Drumheller. We've got all the hoodoos, and maybe you'd have like one of those wicked storms, one of those prairie storms, but you have to stay in this creepy old saloon. So that would be sort of the first thing that comes to mind, is trying to use that place near Drumheller. Okay. Uh, let's see. Are there any other? Yes, it's called Wayne. Thanks, Memphis. It is called Wayne. That's great. Okay. Oh, Alexa has a question. Do I write only scary books? No, actually, I was actually more into writing comedy or humor plays and humor books when I started out. So I like scary stories, but people seem to like when I made them laugh. So Mystery of the Frozen Brains, Mystery of the Cyberbully, those are funny ones. My latest Orca book before Haunted Hospital is Kung Fu Master. So I like to come up with funny books and scary books. If I can combine the two into one, then for me that's the perfect genre. Something that's scary and funny. All right, let's see. Are there any other questions before we wrap things up? Da, da, da. Oh, somebody asked, Phoenix asks, I'm 10 years old. Is that too young to start writing? No, actually, that's the best time to start writing. The sooner you start writing, the better you're going to be. Phoenix, if you start writing now, you're going to be a better writer than me when you're 20 years old, because you would have had a great head start. I didn't start writing until I think I was in grade 11. And it was my high school English teacher, Mr. Nigro, who inspired me to write. He gave our class a homework assignment where we had to pretend we won $1 million, and we could spend our money on anything we wanted. We just had to describe how we'd redecorate our bedroom. Now, I was a lazy teenager, so I decided my dream bedroom would be an elevator bed where I could press a button and I could bring myself to all the things I wanted to do. So I had one floor was dedicated to a library. The next one had a video game arcade. One had a kitchen, but it was like a food court where I could order like pizza and taco time. Next level had a big screen TV, all the movies I wanted to watch. And the final level had an indoor swimming pool. I remember I handed in that assignment, and Mr. Nigro said, Marty, with that imagination, you should become a writer. And that was the moment I started writing. That's when I started playing Dungeons and Dragons. But I wish I would have started when I was 10 years old, because there would have been so many things that I could have written about and learned to become a better writer over those years. All right. Oh, and I've got another question. What was my favorite book? My favorite book of all the ones I've written. I would say my favorite book, do I have it here? Sorry, I don't have a slide for it. But my favorite book of all the ones I've written, to be honest with you, is this book right here. This is True Story, which is my picture book about my two cats. Their names are Buddy and Max. Unfortunately, Max is no longer with us, but Buddy's still around. And the reason why I love this book so much is that it is my sort of memory of those two cats, and it will always have a special place in my heart. All right. Okay. So I think we're going to wrap things up, but I want to share with you one last thing before we go. Just give me a second here while I bring up this screen so you can see better. So right over here, I have a Rubik's Cube, and I'm going to use this to demonstrate something about writers. Now, this was first invented in 1974 by a fellow named Erno Rubik. He was actually named, like this cube is named after the inventor. And when he invented this thing, he was trying to show his architecture students how 3D objects work so that they could basically design their buildings in 3D. Now, when he made this cube, he did what we all do when we have our hands on a Rubik's Cube. He decided, you know what? Let me play around with it. So he started to scramble up the cube. He started mixing it up, right? And he had it nice and jumbled up, and then he did what we all do when we have a mixed up Rubik's Cube. He tried to solve it, right? So he tried to put it back into its original order with all the colors solid on all 6 sides. But you know what? The inventor of the Rubik's Cube couldn't solve his own invention. It took him an entire month to put everything back into the right order with all the colors solid on every side. Now, when I was a kid, I got my hands on a Rubik's Cube and I solved it in 2 minutes. No, really, I did. You want to know how I did it? I peeled off the stickers and I put them in the right spots. Now, they say there's over 43 quintillion combinations for a Rubik's Cube, and only one has all the colors solid on all 6 sides. Same thing with writing. We have millions of ideas, but we're trying to figure out how to organize them into a story that makes sense, something that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Well, the secret to organizing a story is also the trick to solving a Rubik's Cube. Instead of worrying about all the possibilities, all the ideas you have, pick one thing and start building around that. Some writers will pick an opening sentence and they'll build from there. Other writers will pick a setting, a place, and they'll build a world out of it. Me, I like to focus on the main character and build around them. All right, so now take a look at the cube, okay? So you see that red square in the middle, right? That red square, for me, represents the main character of the story. So one red square, main character, I'm going to start to build around that main character, right? So I'm going to start building around that main character. And what will happen is maybe now I've got 2 characters in the story, right? So 2 characters now come into the story. And then I start thinking about things like, where could I set the story? And that might give me a sense of place, right? So that gives me a little bit more to the story. Then I've got to start thinking about things like, what are some obstacles? What could keep my character from getting what they want? And that'll give me more of a shape to the story until finally everything comes together just like this. Now, it takes a long time to organize a story. It takes a long time to solve a Rubik's Cube. But trust me, the more you do it, the better you get at it. So at a certain point, you can have a story as jumbled up as this cube. But if you know what you're doing, all you have to do is apply your imagination. And the next thing you know, everything comes together just like this cube. So always remember, focus on one thing and build up from there. And the one thing that I'd like you all to focus on right now is getting the book from Audrey's. Once again, you can order online from Audrey's or from Orca Book. And if you get your orders in to Audrey's before the middle of November, I will autograph those books, so you will get your own personalized autograph book. Thank you so much to Rhonda for being my special guest. My thanks to Kelly for hosting this. My thanks to all of you for being part of this. And like I said, I hope you enjoy your Halloween. Stay safe. And please do check out my YouTube channel and subscribe, and you'll see more fun presentations like the one I just gave you. All right. Take care, everyone. Have a great night, and we will see you around.